Lacy Hunt, one of our favorite guests of all time. If there was a Mount Rushmore of guests, you would be on it, Dr. Hunt. So for those who are not familiar with, what did you say? Sorry.
You're too kind.
So we're live on YouTube, live on Clubhouse, also on WOR, New York's big 710 AM talk radio station, Spotify, podcasts. And we are answering, we have a live studio audience, so if you have a question, type it in the YouTube chat box or the Clubhouse chat box, and we will go to your questions. Lacy Hunt is a PhD, financial author, internationally known economist, and executive vice president and chief economist of Hoisington Investment Management Company. So, Dr. Hunt, for those who are not familiar with your work, describe your background. What brought you into the financial industry?
Well, I studied economics starting in my sophomore year in college, which was 1962. And by January of 69, I had 3 degrees in the field, including the PhD, which I earned at Temple University. That was 1969, and I went to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And William McChesney Martin was chairman of the Fed. People don't even remember his name really well. But he was the second longest serving Fed chairman. When I left the Dallas Fed, Arthur Burns was chairman. He's more remembered. And I joined the econometric subsidiary of Chase Manhattan in the early 1970s. And Chase Manhattan at the time was run by David Rockefeller, the last surviving grandson of John D. Rockefeller. And that was a great experience that I had an opportunity to do some projects for him, as well as to develop the first large-scale econometric model of the U.S. financial markets. And now I'm in the 54th year of my career as I approach my 81st birthday.
Happy birthday. So what is your econometric model? Do you still do econometric modeling today?
I don't do that anymore, but I have all of those equations and coefficients built into my head. Over the years, I estimated thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of different functions, consumption functions, investment functions, interest rate functions, a whole slew of them. And I'd keep the rest of the scholarly research. So although I'm not producing econometric forecast, I do keep abreast of the work that's going on. And it's important to understand that economics is a science, not a physical science, but our knowledge base increases constantly. And so it's a demanding job to stay abreast of all the new things that we're learning.
No, of course. And what does your research say right now about inflation or deflation? And that's a big question.
Okay, it's a critical question, probably the most important question. Not surprising you would start there. The inflation rate.
Yeah, let's jump right into it, right?
The inflation rate is clearly coming down. We had a peak rate in the vicinity of 9%. We've dropped down to about 5%. But I think that by September, the year-over-year increase in the consumer price index will be 3%, or maybe just a little bit above 3%. And when we get into 2024, I think there's a good chance that we'll be able to return to the Fed's targeted 2% in the core personal consumption expenditures deflator. This is it's been an antagonizingly slow process, but the elements are at work to bring it down.
Well, that's good news then, right?
It is good news. It is good news. It's particularly good news for 180 million Americans who have suffered something like a 5% decline in their basic source of income, adjusted for inflation in the last 9 quarters. our modest and moderate income households have been very badly affected by this inflation. The last 9 quarters are the worst for these 180 million people, really, since the late 1970s, early 1980s. It's more than 40 years ago. Keep in mind, the average age is only 38. So the vast majority of the people that have been severely damaged by the inflation have no historical reference point in their own lifetime to understand what is hit them. And that's why such prestigious surveys as the University of Michigan reflect a consumer that's very depressed and frankly quite concerned about conditions.
So when you say 9 quarters of 5% inflation, does that mean over the last 9 quarters, that's a 45% increase in basic prices?
No, I was talking about the change in wage and salary income for our full-time hourly and salaried workers after inflation.
Okay.
There's been about a 5% loss.
I gotcha.
We also have about 72 million retirees. According to the Social Security Administration, only 11% have income other than their Social Security check. So between the 120 million full-time hourly and salaried workers and the 65 or 67 retirees, there's been a very damaging impact of the inflation. Very damaging impact.
I think, I don't have anything other than Dr. David Ranson said something about 50% increase since this whole cycle started in inflation. And I sort of go with the pizza test, right? You know, pizzas used to be, I guess the inflation rate on a good pizza is about 100%. But I remember when pizzas were $12.50 and now they're $25 for a nice pizza. I don't know what pizzas are. I'm not talking the Costco pizza. I'm talking a really nice Italian pizza from New York, New Jersey. You know, a good place like Brooklyn.
We even have those in Texas now, Josh.
Oh, wow. You know, they always say that, and I think, yeah, I've heard there's New York pizza now in Florida, but whenever I go to Florida or Texas, I never get good. You know, if I go to Texas, I want to get brisket or something that you can't get up here, you know. Although now
we excel in brisket. And if you ever come to Austin, I'll be pleased to take you to the best brisket place in the world.
Oh, I want to go. You know, there is funny in Lakewood, for some reason, there is a Texas-style brisket place in Lakewood, New Jersey that I hear people raving about. But I don't want to go there because it's like $40 for brisket that you can get for like $5 in Texas. So.
No, too, the prices have gone up here too.
Yeah, so.
And your point is really valid. You see, this inflation, like all inflation, is really heavily centered in what we call price inelastic goods that don't have substitutes. They're essential for life, such as food, fuel, and shelter. And your point is really well taken, because for our moderate and modest households, a much higher percentage of their budget is in these basic necessities. And so when you talk about a 5% loss in the standard of living, it's really much greater as you go down the economic spectrum, because their percentage of these necessities is a much higher proportion of their budget. And it's even a more devastating impact worldwide, because outside the United States, income levels are not as high. And they spend an even greater percentage of their budget on the necessities. And so your point is very well taken.
Yeah,
for a lot of people, the inflation rate is much greater than the published inflation rate.
Yeah, I would say it's been 50% since COVID. I have no economic thing other than we bought a van before COVID. That van cost, I don't know, 40, 45 grand. You buy that same van today, it's like 80 grand.
Mm-hmm.
It's those price inelastic goods. I don't know.
Well, you're talking about a durable good. That's price elastic. In the case of a van, you can do several things. First of all, you don't have to pay the higher price. If you need to fill your car up with gasoline, you need to feed your family. There, you don't have any choice. You're a price taker.
So what's price inelastic? Food, gas,
food, fuel, and shelter. There's no good substitute. When there are no good substitutes, the demand is price inelastic. The consumer has to basically take the price. Oh, what you can do, and we're seeing this now, is the consumer budgets are under such pressure that consumers are buying less fresh meat, and they're shifting down from beef down to fish and chicken. And now we're seeing a shift from fresh beef to canned beef, canned chicken, fish, and we're seeing consumers shift to store brands rather than name brands. And I think they're doing that because they've been badly hurt by the inflation. And so for a lot of people, the inflation rate is higher. But the published numbers are weighted based on the average market basket for all of us. But high inflation does not work. Inflation robs everyone, but it robs the modest and moderate income households the most.
So what are we to do? I mean, no one seems to really care. I mean, we care with our budgets, but politically, you would think that would be some major political issue. And generally, I mean, we had an election, November 2022? It kind of status quo remained. People thought there'd be some big revolt. There really wasn't. It became a referendum on Trump again, instead of the vast inflation. You would have thought there would have been some, like they had the Reagan Revolution in the 80s. You'd have thought there would have been some, public outcry. And even looking into the 2024 election, you really don't hear, you hear more culture wars. You hear, it's Trump Biden rematch, a little DeSantis thrown in, a little Kennedy thrown in. It seems like the average electorate is just dumb about what's really going on. I mean, this is a bipartisan issue. It affects Republicans and Democrats the same, but there's been no sort of coalition around this issue.
I think that what you say is absolutely correct as of right now. But I suspect that as time goes by and as this burden persists on our hardworking households, that they're going to be much more, show much greater concern about the status of things. And so while we haven't seen it yet, I believe that it's coming.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. Like we have, in the 90s, you had Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton kind of compromised together to lower the debt. It seems like with the debt ceiling talk, it seems like more of the same. So,
well, keep in mind that a large part of the problem was a catastrophic error at the Federal Reserve. As part of the coordinated monetary and fiscal policy response to the pandemic, we had record monetary growth. In fact, they created a huge mountain of money and credit in 2020 and 2021. And so we had the classic definition of too much money chasing too few goods because there were supply side disruptions. But now we have a record monetary contraction. And one of the calculations that I do is I look at what's happened to the growth in money over the last 3 years, which takes in the money mountain of 2020 and 21, and also last year and this year. And after adjustment for inflation, money has shown no growth for 3 years. Historically, it's grown at 3% per annum. And so from excess of money, we've gone now to a shortage of money. The bank credit, which is the bank's lending investing. Bank credit adjusted for inflation over the last 3 years has also gone negative. And so the factors that created the inflation are being reversed. And these processes work very slowly, but they are effective. And I think another thing to take into consideration is that if you look at the supply chains, the New York Fed has developed a supply availability index. It indicates that the supplies are now more available than they were at the depths of the great financial crisis. So we're going to see a change, and it's going to be difficult for a lot of industries because we've had a tremendous explosion in, for example, homes, rent, automobile prices. You mentioned that, but household income is not kept up. It's lagged far behind. And so you have a disconnect between the price of these big ticket items and what's happened to household income. And so they're going to have to be, this process is going to have to work itself out. It's going to be difficult. But it's happening. And some of the economies that are much worse shape than we are fundamentally because of excessive over-indebtedness, poor demographics, other considerations like China, which is heavily dependent upon selling to the rest of the world. China may already be moving into a deflation. The consumer price index has declined over the last 3 months, over the last 6 months. Wholesale prices quite negative over the last year. So that although inflation is still high and it's remaining sticky, the picture is not only changing domestically, but it's changing internationally as well.
But I look at housing, I'm looking at the Fed's, and when we return from the break, we'll talk with Dr. Lacy Hunt about sales prices of houses sold for the U.S. A lot of people trying to buy a home. Should they sell right now? Should they buy? We'll look at some of the St. Louis Fed data on housing. When we return, this is Josh Jalinski, the financial quarterback. Don't touch that dial. And we're back with Dr. Lacy Hunt. So I'm looking at a median sales price house sold for the U.S. and saw a precipitous drop from average price was $479,500 median price Q4 2022 down to $436,800 Q1 2023. And I believe it'll fall further in maybe areas that kind of grew white hot, like parts of Texas. But I'm seeing, and maybe you could comment on that as a Texan.
Yeah, we're familiar with that situation.
But I'm not seeing that now I'm looking at things anecdotally. I'm not really looking at all of the data other than this and kind of what I know, the area where I live. So New Jersey, for example, still staying, white hot because there's a glut of, there's no supply in New Jersey. They didn't build and they're not building. And then all of New York seemed to have come down in New Jersey due to COVID. People don't want to stay in the city anymore based on government lockdown. So it seems to have almost caused a generational shift. So am I just, and I'm looking at Florida, which, Florida's booming. Doesn't seem like, it seems like it's stalled. New Jersey seems like it's stalled, but it's not collapsing. Will that collapse be in a year or two, or is that just a new normal in some of those areas? So if you think of like California was hot for 20, 30 years, is now nobody wants to live in California anymore. When you look at housing, how much of that is regional versus the average?
I think there are vast regional differences, but I also think that your characterization is correct. And one of the situations here is that people bought in at very high prices But when they bought in, the mortgage rates were exceptionally low, so the cost of shelter to those individuals is very low, and the home prices have eased off a little bit. It's not a big drop, but people have this very low cost of financing that's built into their decision making process, and they don't need to sell. In fact, they don't want to sell. There are indications that that people are declining opportunities for promotion if it entails a move, because they don't want to give up the cost of their current house. So the existing home prices are holding relatively firm there with these regional differences. The biggest downward adjustment has been in the new home prices, where the builders have inventory. What they're interested in turnover and volume, and in the current environment with the mortgage rates very high, they've been forced to cut prices. In fact, they've even provided buy down. So I think it makes a difference whether you're talking new homes or existing homes. But right now we have a major disconnect, and we've made only a partial adjustment of bringing some of the big ticket costs into alignment with income. And right now there is a huge disparity, very huge, unprecedented, really.
Have you seen where there's, in your study of history the last 100 years, it almost seems to me big jump in prices and now there's a new floor. So it's almost like that 479, that may go down to 400 regionally or 350, which would be a sharp decline. But whereas the old floor maybe was 225 nationally, now it's going to be 325 or 350. Have you seen in your studies of history, like, is it just now like people think a house costs $500,000, to raise a family of four? So that's sort of I think of even places in New Jersey that should be 350. Now they're $500,000. Now they're not, maybe it was 600 a year ago and now it's 550. But it seems like nobody's selling now if they don't get their number, because in 2008, people had to sell because they had ninja loans. They were getting foreclosed on. You're not seeing a ton of foreclosures because a lot of people bought with cash or low debt, low interest rates for 30 years. I have a mortgage, 2.5% for 30 years. I'll keep that forever, even if I can pay it off.
I think that the process is going to require time, but there's a critical element in the picture that we haven't discussed, and the reason that people have not been willing to cut the prices is not only the fact that they're well situated and they have the low financing costs, but the labor markets have remained relatively firm. But the labor markets are in the process of changing, and I think they're going to get much weaker as we go through the balance of this year and into next year. And so I think it's best if we hold off judgment to actually the degree of adjustment that will take place once the labor markets become more difficult for the typical person.
Now, that's a good point. Okay, we're going to go to the audience. We have WUSA who has a question for Dr. Hunt. Go ahead, WUSA. Unless you want me to read it. Has the Fed overcorrected for inflation? And what are the risks associated with that?
Well, that's an excellent question, and keep in mind that this inflationary problem was created by the Fed, and in conjunction with fiscal policy. This combined monetary fiscal policy. The Fed really is supposed to be independent. They became partners of the fiscal folks during the pandemic when the pandemic response blew up with inflation, the fiscal folks left, leaving the entire job on the Fed. Makes it very difficult. But keep in mind, broad measures of money and liquidity increased 20% per annum for 2 years. So the average rate of growth in nominal dollars is 7, unheard of. And I think that when you have these extreme monetary fluctuations, they tend to boom the booms. And then when you have a record monetary deceleration, such as we now have, that slumps the slump. The Fed is ill-advised to swing monetary policy so radically, both to the upside and then to the downside. As a matter of fact, if you look at inflation and if you look at money growth in inflation-adjusted terms, we have the largest contraction since 1934. Well, that speaks volumes to me that you have to go all the way back to the Great Depression to find a decline. I don't believe we're going to have a repeat of the Great Depression, but this is a major monetary swing, and this process is working its way out. Another great difficulty is that monetary policy doesn't work quickly. It's very, very slow working. I like to think of the economy not as one business cycle, but 3 interconnecting sine waves. The financial cycle leads the GDP cycle that leads the price labor cycle. And I calculate from the peak of the financial cycle to the peak of the GDP cycle, there's a lead time of about 5 to 8 quarters. Then there's another lead time from the GDP cycle peak to the price labor cycle peak. It's another 1 to 2 quarters. Well, the maximum looseness of monetary policy, or the peak of the financial cycle, occurred in the fourth quarter of 2021. So when we conclude the quarter that we're currently in, we will have gone 6 quarters. And at the end of the year, we'll be at the 8th quarter. So based on historical experience, the monetary impact is just beginning to filter into the economy. And I think that there is a risk that the Federal Reserve will err on the downside just as they erred on the upside. They don't have a very good record of stabilizing economic activity.
No, exactly. It's amazing how many people talk of all these cycles converging. We have a technical analyst on staff who's big into the cycles, and even plots out the real estate cycle that he's saying it kind of peaks out in I think he says 2025, then it starts to decline dramatically. I don't have his data in front of me, but it's amazing how each of these cycles, there's an interest rate cycle, there's a stock market cycle. When do you think this, are we in a recession, and when does the recession end?
Okay. So I like to think of the GDP cycle as having 5 phases. There are 2 in recession. The first one is called ease off, when you just begin to sort of roll over. And then ease off goes on for sometimes a half a year, sometimes even a little bit longer. And then you hit the waterfall, which I call the plunge phase. And then the expansion has 3 phases. The first is revival. You come down to the trough, you start turning up. Then acceleration, when you really kick into high gear. That's the middle part of an expansion. And then there's a maturation. Now, if you look at these 2 phases, the first phase of a recession, which is ease off, and the final stage of an expansion, which is maturation, it's very, very difficult to know which one you're in. You can really only determine this after the fact. But I'll give you an example right now that provides a very dramatic conflict. Theoretically, the sum of what we spend, what we call gross domestic income, gross domestic product, GDP, should be equal to what we earn, gross domestic income. And theoretically, they're supposed to add to the same number. Now, the income sources are different than the spending side. And so they never line up. And so when you look at the national income and product accounts each quarter, you'll see that there is a statistical discrepancy. So in the fourth quarter and in the first quarter, the real GDP continued to rise. However, the real gross domestic income, which is what the households in the corporate sector earn, declined. In fact, they declined even if we exclude the losses at the Federal Reserve, which are included on the gross domestic income. So when you have this kind of divergence between gross domestic product and gross domestic income, it's really not, you really don't have a basis for knowing whether the GDP is a correct indicator of where we are or whether the gross domestic income is. So the point that I'm making to you is that there are a lot of major conflicts in the data. Another one that I think is quite profound. Students of economics will really appreciate this. Since January, according to the monthly payroll employment, the establishment survey, which is widely followed, we have 1.1 million new jobs. But we have an alternative survey called the household survey. And the household survey is only up 500,000 jobs since January. In addition, we have a huge dichotomy between the payroll employment and the number of hours that people are working. In January, the average person was working 34.6 hours a week. Now it's down to 34.3. Well, if you take a weighted average of payroll employment and the average work week, it's something called aggregate hours worked, we're actually down 0.5% since January. So firms have been hiring workers, but they don't have enough for them to do. And they're cutting the work week. Well, that's not an efficient operation, because when you hire a new worker, you have a lot of upfront fixed costs. If you really need labor and you expand the work week, you don't incur those fixed costs. And another important discrepancy, probably the most important one of all, is that the hiring has been going on at a time when output per hour, or what we call productivity, is dropping sharply. We've had a decline, a very sharp decline, unprecedented decline for 9 quarters in output per worker hour. And I'm going to tell you something, and this is just basic economics. This is not my opinion, but this is the economics profession. To have a rising standard of living, you have to have an increase in productivity. You have to have an increase in productivity for firms to be able to cover the inflation rate and the wage increases. Right now, wages are below inflation. And one of the reasons is because productivity is performing so poorly. Now, historically, when productivity drops this sharply, as it has over the last 9 quarters, it's really a sign that firms have redundant employees. And so in order for the business sector to become more profitable, they're going to have to rationalize their workforce. And that's going to create a whole different set of problems, because then that will cut income and the ability of a lot of folks to buy. The unemployment rate will go higher, but it will lower unit labor costs. And so right now we have a very mixed picture We have some indicators that look fine, but we have others of equally important merit. As I said, the income and expenditure side of the national income and product accounts give you a different answer. But I think that this monetary restraint that's moving through the system ultimately means that in this case, the gross domestic income is going to prove to be a more valid indicator than the gross domestic product.
I would agree with you. I think the productivity thing is due to work from home. You have so many people who are still working from home and their productivity is dropping sharply. I don't have any data on that. I'm just being an employer. You know, we have these debates between me and my chief technology officer. You know, he's used to a workforce where they can work from home. Yes, and if you worked for a telecom or if you worked for IBM, those people have been doing that for 30 years. They're used to that. But the average person wasn't. So they don't really know how to effectively balance work and life and home responsibilities. So I think employers are going to wake up. I would say next year we start seeing that cascading decline. This is just, I'm not looking at any numbers, just kind of me being an employer, talking to thousands of people every year. We do, you know, about 50 client interviews every week. So that's about 2,500 a year. And I'm seeing, okay, people are working from home, but they're not really committed, or they are committed. And it's generally the people who are used to working from home. They've been doing it for 20, 30 years. There's no decrease in productivity there. But the millennial, no offense on millennials, but, you know, who never had to do this, they're not gaining the job skills necessary to advance. And they're going to be laid off in, you know, I would say a couple of quarters as, I mean, we're already seeing it in some of the large tech firms where they can, you know, basically they can spy on their employees so they can figure out, okay, how many hours are you in? What were the efficiency? And that's I believe, why Facebook and those other companies laid off 30,000 people right away. They were seeing, hey, people aren't doing calls. I don't know.
Well, first, let me say that I think your point is well taken. I think that there is some loss in productivity, but that factor alone, I don't believe explains it all. And another element is that when things were really hot as a pistol in 2021, and this inflation was roaring itself up, and a lot of industries were firing ahead, they extrapolated those demand increases to 2023, 24, and 25. And it was hard for them to obtain workers. And so they got in a frantic position of bidding for them. And they've gradually been able to stock up. Well, that experience, first of all, it means that they've overexpanded. They took the conditions of 2021 and early 2022 as being much better than could possibly exist longer term. And so now they have too much capacity. I'll give you another example. In the early 1970s, there was a monetary fiscal policy coordination between President Nixon and the Federal Reserve led by Arthur Burns. I was actually in the Fed at the time, observed it very closely. Nixon closed the gold window, turned fiscal policy very stimulative way. The Federal Reserve accelerated monetary growth, which allowed the lower dollar, which ensued from the closing of the gold window, to push domestic inflation in. And to temporarily contain the inflation, wage and price controls were imposed, which allowed the Fed to continue to have very rapid growth.
When was that, 69?
Sorry.
When was that, 1969?
It's 1971.
Okay.
August of 71, right ahead of the 72 election. And the independence of the Federal Reserve was greatly compromised Arthur Burns was made chairman of the Interest and Dividend Control Committee, which was part of the price and wage controls. And he was chairman of the Fed. That should have never happened. And then the inflation blew up. Firms couldn't initially obtain workers because labor markets were so tight. When demand turned down, the firms hoarded their labor. They held on to them. But then as the inflation was contained and the overinvestment became apparent, then had a big increase in the unemployment rate. Firms were forced to cut back because productivity was so dropping so sharply. But the current drop in productivity right now is more serious than it was in 73 and 74, which means that the overstaffing is greater than it was then. And so I think that there was a major miscalculation of what was invested, not only in plant and equipment, but in people. And when there's a major miscalculation like that, I think it's very difficult to admit that you made a mistake. But this is going to have to be dealt with as we go forward, and firms are going to have to rationalize their workforce. When they do that, the productivity will rise, unit labor costs will fall, demand will also fall, and we'll see a more significant downward response to the inflation rate.
We have a question from Jay. Go ahead, Jay, if you want to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on people working at home. I mean, it seems like companies and firms are retaining talent because it's a lot harder to get people with certain skill sets, especially in tech that are on the programming side. But if productivity is going down, don't you feel like creativity is going in some ways? You have this ability to, think of an idea, hybrid workforce, go in, actually compare it with, your colleagues and implement things. That would make systems more efficient. And when you have a more efficient system by the numbers, it's going to be weighted against the number of employees you have. So your metric would be skewed. And yes, productivity per employee would go down, but you're getting more done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that in many ways, working at home is very efficient. But there in the world, there are always a lot of moving parts. A lot of things are going on. And if that were the only thing going on, I think the productivity numbers would be much better than they are, which harkens back to the point that I was just making. I think one of the reasons that the dominant element in the productivity problem, which is severe, really unprecedented, that we're experiencing right now, is the fact that firms over-anticipated that the monetary demand during the pandemic response would continue, and they overexpanded, and that the overexpansion is dominating whatever creativity effects are originating from the work at home. I think your point is well taken, and it's a fact of life. I agree with it, but there was a far greater problem, and that was the overexpansion, massive overexpansion.
Great. We have another question from the audience, which is, what happens if everything going on makes traditional models of forecasting irrelevant? Do we need new models? Kind of an interesting question.
In other words, this time it's different.
I guess.
There's no business cycles are never alike, but they definitely rhyme. And I don't really see anything unique or that's extremely out of the ordinary, other than the pandemic response. The pandemic response was we really only had this one other monetary fiscal policy coordination. Another difficulty, one which I freely admit to having not dealt with it very well myself, is that the Federal Reserve was set up to be lender of last resort, not spender of last resort. And I think the Fed overstepped that bound. And this added to the problem. And so a lot of the difficulty that we're having belongs to the faulty response of both monetary and fiscal policy. I think that that we should not have expected the fiscal policy partners to be there. They make a deal with the Fed, but when there's a problem, then the Fed has the entire cleanup job on its own hand. Arthur Burns made a deal with Nixon, but when the problem arose and became serious, Nixon was not responsive, and so the whole cleanup job fell on Burns. And this situation is really no different. It's a nice thing to talk about fiscal and monetary policy coordination, but I hope this country has learned its lesson. You want to keep the Federal Reserve independent.
Now, as I'm thinking, as kind of we round out the next 4 minutes of the interview, I'm thinking of, talk about history rhyming. It's almost rhyming exactly with the late 60s, early 70s. And that exogenous shock of COVID is like the exogenous shock of Nixon taking us off the gold standard. And if that's true, we're in for a very rough decade. I have one cycles analyst who says we might have bad news from now to like 2029, just because of kind of the wet blanket effect that you talk of disinflation and debt. And if things don't improve, kind of we're screwed. But if you look at the S&P, and the S&P is not the same as it was in the 60s and 70s, but there are certain similarities. Okay, you have 1969, negative 8.4%. Then a little rally, 3.89, 14.22 in 71, 18.96 in 72. Then 73, negative 14.67, 74, negative 26.31. The thing that I'm trying to figure out is 2023 1970 or 75? If history's rhyming, and it's not exactly the same, but I do think I find it fascinating that you went right to the 70s, because I think.
Well, there are a lot of potential similarities. So in 1973 and 1975, as a result of trying to deal with the inflation that was caused by the monetary fiscal response in 71, we had a very deep recession. Depending on how you want to judge it, it was probably the deepest recession since the end of World War II, even deeper than the great financial crisis. It was very, very difficult. But when the recession started to emerge, the Federal Reserve swung dramatically against monetary restraint. Now, the inflation rate had come down just a little bit, but the problem wasn't fully contained. And so when the Federal Reserve then reaccelerated monetary growth, the net result was that we took a deep recession from 73 to 75, but the inflation problem was not solved by the recession because Burns was so anxious to try to get the economy back to a better level of overall operation. And as a result of that, the inflation rate continued moving higher all the way, until the early 1980s. It took two new chairmen of the Federal Reserve. One, G. William Miller, who made even worse mistakes than Arthur Burns, and then he was replaced by Paul Volcker. Volcker finally succeeded. So, in large measure, this problem of the 70s, which you're referring to, and I think very wisely so, is that the Fed has to do the right kind of response, and if they move judiciously and allow the inflation rate to come back into their target, and the response is reasonable, then we won't replay the 70s. But if the Federal Reserve swings in a major fashion, such as was done in the 70s, and allows the inflation rate to get off the mat before it's contained, then we could replay the 70s. And so I think you're quite correct to raise that situation. And at this point in time, we don't have enough information. The Federal Reserve appears to be trying to get the inflation rate under control, but it's not under control yet. And they won't be at their target, by my opinion, until 2024. We'll be making progress, but they have a ways to go. And then we have to learn what their response is and the degree of the response.
People can find more about your work by going to hoisington.com. That's HOISINGTON.com. Anything else you'd like to share with our listeners, either a plug for something or parting thoughts?
No, the only thing I'd like to say is that I'm here purely for educational purposes. I'm not trying to sell anything, and I'm not advertising the products of Hoisington Management. You're very nice to mention them.
Oh, yeah.
But this is just an educational endeavor as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly.
Josh.
So, yeah, we're not giving investment advice over the airwaves. So thank you so much, Dr. Lacy Hunt. Always a pleasure to have you. And thank you all for listening, watching on YouTube, Clubhouse, Spotify, iHeartRadio. Hit the subscribe button, and want to thank you for joining us. Bye, Dr. Hunt. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. You're a great interviewer, Josh.